Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Sometimes these surprises shake the very foundation of what we believe to be possible. This is the remarkable story of Velma Thomas, a woman whose experience challenges our understanding of life, death, and everything that lies between. In the quiet hills of West Virginia, Velma Thomas lived a life built on faith, family, and community service. She was known throughout her neighborhood as someone who could always be counted on, whether it was organizing church events, helping a neighbor in need, or simply being there to listen when someone needed a friendly ear. Her warm smile and gentle demeanor made her a beloved figure in her community, but no one could have predicted that she would become the center of one of the most extraordinary medical events in recent memory. October 2008 began like any other month in Velma's life. At 59, she had settled into a comfortable routine, balancing her time between family responsibilities and community activities. She was the kind of person who always put others first, making sure everyone around her was taken care of before thinking of herself. This selfless nature had earned her deep respect from everyone who knew her. The morning that would change everything started normally enough. Velma went about her usual tasks, preparing for what she thought would be just another ordinary day. But as the morning progressed, something felt different. At first, it was just a slight discomfort, the kind that's easy to dismiss as nothing serious. Many of us might have done exactly that, brushed it off as simple fatigue, or maybe a touch of indigestion. But this was different. The discomfort gradually transformed into something more concerning. Velma began experiencing severe chest pain, accompanied by shortness of breath that made even the simplest movements difficult. It wasn't long before she realized this wasn't something that would simply pass on its own. Her family, seeing her distress, immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Mom wasn't looking right, her son Tim would later recall. Her face had gone pale, and she was struggling to catch her breath. I'd never seen her like that before. The family's quick response might have been the difference between life and death, at least initially. They called emergency services without hesitation, and within minutes, the quiet morning was pierced by the sound of approaching sirens. Paramedics arrived to find Velma in clear distress, her condition deteriorating rapidly. The trip to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and urgent voices. The paramedics worked efficiently, monitoring Velma's vital signs and providing emergency care as they rushed her to the nearest medical facility. For her family, following the ambulance in their own vehicle, those minutes felt like hours. Each red light was an eternity, each turn a moment suspended in time. Upon arrival at the hospital, Velma was immediately surrounded by a team of medical professionals. The emergency room burst into focused activity as doctors and nurses worked to assess and stabilize her condition. The diagnosis was swift and grave. Velma was experiencing a massive heart attack, one that was threatening not just her heart but her entire system. The medical team sprang into action with practiced precision. They administered medications, attached monitoring equipment, and began the complex process of trying to save Velma's life. The scene was intense, a choreographed emergency response where every second counted, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Dr. James Mitchell, the attending physician that day, would later describe it as one of the most challenging cases he'd ever encountered. When Mrs. Thomas came in, we knew we were dealing with a severe cardiac event, he would explain. But none of us could have predicted how this case would unfold. For hours, the medical team fought to stabilize Velma's condition. They used every tool and technique at their disposal: medication, defibrillation, and constant monitoring. But despite their best efforts, Velma's heart continued to struggle. The situation became increasingly dire as her vital signs weakened. Then came the moment every doctor dreads. Velma's heart stopped beating altogether. The room erupted into even more intense activity as the medical team began resuscitation efforts. The rhythmic sound of chest compressions filled the air, punctuated by the urgent voices of medical staff calling out vital signs and requesting medications. Time seemed to slow down in that emergency room. Minutes stretched into hours as the team worked tirelessly to restart Velma's heart. They refused to give up, even as the situation became increasingly hopeless. But with each passing moment, the likelihood of a successful resuscitation diminished. Finally, after exhausting every possible intervention, Dr. Mitchell had to make the hardest decision a physician can face. The medical team had done everything humanly possible, but Velma showed no signs of recovery. Her heart had been stopped for an extended period, and there was no detectable brain activity. With heavy hearts, the medical team was forced to acknowledge what seemed to be the inevitable truth: Velma Thomas had passed away. The time of death was recorded, and the machines that had been working so hard to keep her alive were gradually switched off. The news hit the family like a physical blow. Tim, who had been pacing the waiting room for hours, collapsed into a chair when Dr. Mitchell delivered the news. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. "I couldn't believe it," Tim would later say. "Mom was always so strong, so full of life. The idea that she could be gone just like that, it didn't seem real." The hospital staff, compassionate and understanding, gave the family time to process their loss. They provided a private room where family members could gather to say their goodbyes. One by one, they came to sit with Velma, sharing memories and expressing their love for the woman who had meant so much to them. Friends and extended family began arriving at the hospital as word spread of Velma's passing. Each new arrival brought fresh waves of grief as the reality of the loss hit home again and again. The hospital room became a place of mourning, filled with tears, prayers, and shared memories of a life well lived. As the hours passed, most of the family members gradually departed, exhausted by grief and the emotional toll of the day. But Tim couldn't bring himself to leave his mother's side. He sat in the quiet room, holding her hand, remembering all the time she had been there for him throughout his life. The hospital staff understood his need to stay and didn't rush him. They checked in periodically, offering comfort and support, but otherwise left him to his vigil. The night settled in, bringing with it a deep silence broken only by the distant sounds of hospital activity. 17 hours had passed since Velma had been declared dead. Her body lay still, showing no signs of life. The medical staff had begun making preparations for her body to be moved to the morgue. It seemed the final chapter of Velma Thomas's life had been written. But sometimes, just when we think we understand how the world works, something happens that challenges everything we believe to be true. It started with something so subtle it could easily have been missed. A slight twitch of Velma's hand. Tim, who had been lost in his thoughts, almost didn't notice it at first. When it happened again, he convinced himself it was just his imagination, a trick of his grief-stricken mind seeing what he desperately wanted to see. But then it happened again, more distinctly this time. Tim's heart began to race as he leaned closer, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of hope and disbelief. A nurse who had come to check on them noticed something even more extraordinary, a faint but distinct pulse on the monitoring equipment that hadn't yet been removed. At first, she thought it must be a malfunction. After all, Velma had been declared dead for 17 hours. But as she checked more closely, she realized what she was seeing was real. The next few minutes were a blur of activity as medical staff rushed back into the room. Doctors who had pronounced Velma dead hours earlier now found themselves witnessing something that defied medical explanation. Not only was there a pulse, but there were also signs of brain activity, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing minute. What happened next would be documented in medical journals and discussed in medical conferences for years to come. Velma Thomas, who had been clinically dead for 17 hours, began to show increasingly strong signs of life. Her body temperature, which had cooled after death, began to warm. Her color started to return. Most remarkably, her brain activity continued to strengthen. The medical staff worked with focused intensity, now trying to support and stabilize a patient who, by all previous medical understanding, should not be alive. They administered oxygen, monitored her vital signs, and watched in amazement as Velma's body seemed to restart itself system by system. Dr. Mitchell, who had pronounced her death hours earlier, struggled to find words to explain what he was witnessing. "In all my years of medical practice," he would later say, "I've never seen anything like this. There's no medical explanation for someone coming back to life after being dead for 17 hours. Tim remained by his mother's side, his earlier grief now transformed into cautious hope. He watched as color returned to her cheeks, and her breathing became stronger and more regular. It was as if he was witnessing a miracle unfold before his very eyes. The most extraordinary moment was yet to come. As the medical team continued to monitor her progress, Velma's eyes began to flutter. Slowly, deliberately, she opened them. Her gaze, though initially unfocused, gradually sharpened as she took in her surroundings. Tim, who had been holding his breath without realizing it, felt tears streaming down his face as his mother's eyes met his. "Mom," he whispered again, this time his voice filled with joy rather than grief. Velma's first words were soft but clear. "I'm here, Tim." Those simple words carried so much weight, so much meaning. They were words that just hours ago, no one thought they would ever hear again. The medical staff quickly began assessment procedures, checking her cognitive functions and neurological responses. To their amazement, Velma was not only conscious but fully aware and coherent. She could remember her name, the current year, and recognized her family members. There appeared to be no sign of the brain damage that should have been inevitable after such a long period without oxygen. But it wasn't just Velma's survival that would capture attention. It was what she had to say about her experience during those 17 hours that would truly astonish everyone who heard her story. As she gained strength, Velma began to share what she had experienced during the time she was clinically dead. Her voice was calm and certain as she described something that defied ordinary explanation. "I wasn't gone," she said, her voice filled with a peaceful certainty. "I was somewhere else, somewhere beautiful." She described a sensation of floating, of being free from pain and fear. She spoke of a brilliant, warm light that seemed to encompass all the love and joy she had ever known. "I could see everything that was happening in the hospital room," she continued. "I saw Tim sitting beside my body, saw the doctors pronouncing me dead, saw my family grieving. But I wasn't afraid. I felt such peace, such complete and perfect peace." Velma described encountering what she believed were the spirits of loved ones who had passed away before her. Though they didn't speak in words, she felt their presence and their love. "They were waiting for me," she said, "but they also seemed to know it wasn't my time yet." As Velma recounted her experience, she described a moment that stood apart from the rest. Amid the warmth and peace of the brilliant light, she encountered a figure she recognized immediately as Jesus. The encounter was profound, filling her with a sense of unconditional love and understanding that defied description. However, Velma also carried back a message that struck a different chord. "He told me to share this with everyone," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she recalled the moment. "While the love and beauty of the afterlife are beyond words, he warned me about the choices we make in this life. I was shown glimpses of suffering, of what happens when people live without compassion, kindness, or accountability for their actions. It was horrifying, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of turning away from love and truth." Velma's message was clear. The choices we make in life ripple far beyond our current understanding. He sent me back to remind people that life is a gift, a chance to grow in love and purpose. But how we use that gift matters immensely. As Velma continued to recover, she shared more details about her experience. She spoke of gaining a profound understanding of life's purpose and the interconnectedness of all things. The message she brought back was simple yet powerful. Love is the most important force in the universe. Everything we worry about, all our daily struggles and conflicts, they seem so small from that perspective, she explained. What matters is how we love, how we treat each other, how we use our time here on Earth. Her experience had given her a new perspective on life and death. Death isn't the end, she would say. It's not something to fear. It's just a transition to something else, something beautiful. But we each have our time here, our purpose to fulfill. The medical staff, many of whom had witnessed countless deaths over their careers, were deeply moved by Velma's account. Even the most skeptical among them found it difficult to dismiss her experience, especially given the extraordinary circumstances of her return to life. News of Velma's experience began to spread, first throughout the hospital, then beyond. People who had lost loved ones found comfort in her story. Those struggling with their own fear of death gained a new perspective. Her message of love and purpose resonated with people from all walks of life. Tim noticed a profound change in his mother after her experience. "She was always a loving person," he said, "but now there's something different about her. It's like she carries this deep peace with her wherever she goes." Velma began receiving requests to share her story with others. She spoke at local churches, community centers, and support groups for people dealing with grief and loss. Her gentle manner and quiet certainty brought comfort to many who were struggling with questions about life, death, and what lies beyond. As she regained her strength, Velma felt a deep sense of purpose about sharing her experience. "I was sent back for a reason," she would say. "There's so much fear and uncertainty in the world about death. If my story can help ease that fear, even a little bit, then that's what I need to do." She began volunteering at the hospital where she had been pronounced dead, spending time with terminal patients and their families. Her presence brought comfort to those facing their own mortality, and her story gave hope to families dealing with loss. Medical researchers became interested in her case, and Velma willingly participated in studies about near-death experiences. While science couldn't explain what had happened to her, her case contributed to a growing body of research about consciousness and the nature of death. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Velma's story is the hope it offers. In a world where death is often seen as the ultimate end, her experience suggests there might be something more, something beyond our current understanding. While everyone's beliefs about death and the afterlife are deeply personal, Velma's story offers a perspective that many find comforting. For the medical community, her case remains a fascinating mystery. How could someone return to life after being clinically dead for so long? How did she avoid the brain damage that should have been inevitable after such a long period without oxygen?